Hello there, badgers. So we are going. We are doing episode 7 today of Enviro-Vid, and this one is going of. We're going again on the British Ecological Society Natural-Based Solutions report, and this time we're looking at heathlands. Authors of this are Isabel Alonso of Natural England, Bethany Chamberlain of British Ecological Society, Jamie Fagundes, University of A Coruña, David Glaves of Natural England, and Mike Smedley of Nature Scott. Key points in this one are key points in this one. Number one, heathlands are successful habitats that store high levels of carbon, mainly in the soil. Most types of heathlands require management to maintain their structure, function, and characteristic assemblage of species which can conflict with climate mitigation initiatives. For example, planting trees or allowing natural succession. Any active climate mitigation initiatives, climate mitigation initiatives need to consider the resulting changes in biodiversity, including losses of heathland specialists and other open ground species. So we're talking like the red kite, for example, or the buzzard, and many other land species and whatnot. You get on, but so 4. Soil disturbance as a result of management actions can increase carbon emissions from the soil stock. Thus, soil conservation and minimal disturbance is the best mitigation tool against carbon emissions from the ecosystem. So yeah, like if we start digging up the heathlands, like that's just going to release a load more carbon into the atmosphere. Removing conifers from afforested heathland may result in some carbon emissions, but will benefit the soil carbon stores and heathland biodiversity in the long term. So, in this case, we do want to remove the trees, because the trees that we added there, either because they look nice or because we needed them for logging, but it wasn't good for the land. It wasn't good for the carbon storage effect that the soil in heathlands provides. Which makes sense. Number 5, heathlands undergoing shrub or tree encroachment may release carbon into the atmosphere from the soil, which will not be offset by the growing shrubs or trees for decades. Yeah, so the problem with trying to offset the carbon emissions using plants is it takes a long time, especially trees. It takes a long time for them to grow and get to the point where they actually give us that benefit of offsetting the carbon emissions. Number 7, creating heathland from ex-arable land will result in increased carbon sequestration in soils and vegetation. So take farms that can no longer be used as farmland that can no longer be used as farmland, turn that into heathland. Number 8, some grazing can have positive effect on habitat quality, but it can increase greenhouse gas emissions depending on the species and the breeds. Yeah, like too much sheep. Restoring degraded heathland, for example, overgrazed and transformed into grassland, and those that have been transformed into grassland, will also result in increased carbon sequestration in soils and vegetation. And number 10, in the uplands, a reduction to grazing levels on heathlands and more careful targeting of habitats suitable for burning would result in increased carbon sequestration. Yeah, so instead of just burning where like, do more research, target it better, more carefully. So, introduction. That's better. In the United Kingdom, heathlands characterised by heathers, shrubs of the Ericaceae family are found in the lowlands and uplands. They may also contain bare ground, grassy patches, bryophytes, and lichens that and generally have a limited cover of trees and bracken. So a lot of moorland is very much like that. Oh shit. Heather-dominated vegetation on deep peat in coastal situations or on mountain tops, including blanket bog, alpine heath, and moss heath, are beyond the scope of this chapter. Further information on the potential for nature-based solutions in peatlands can be found in a later chapter, which is the next one actually, which will likely be the next episode of this series. Heathlands occur in mostly acidic and nutrient-poor soils and show transitions from dry to wet types on a variety of substrates, from mineral soils to shallow peat. In the UK, although ecologically they are a continuum, there is a management-based division between upland and lowland heathlands, and these face different threats respectively. For example, undermanagement in the lowlands and livestock overgrazing and overburning in the uplands. Although post-glacial wildwood would have had healthy areas, heathlands expanded and were exploited by people over centuries. The area covered by the heathlands in the UK has declined significantly, particularly since the end of the Second World War in 1945. The areas that remain have suffered declines in habitat quality and species losses. Despite the need for regular management to maintain the characteristic openness of this habitat, people have often see them as natural or even wild places, particularly in the uplands. Again, I will put the link to this in the description, so people can scroll through with me if you want. Number 3, climate change mitigation potential. Most of the carbon in heathland ecosystems is in the soil. Office of National Statistics in 2020 said that 98% in soils versus 2% in vegetation. Organic soils with greater than 60% organic matter, contain the largest amount of carbon, but mineral soils can also be important as carbon stores. Thus, soil conservation and minimal disturbance is the best mitigation tool against carbon emissions from the ecosystem. So, trying to conserve the soil and trying not to disturb the land so much in the heathlands is probably the best way we can save that land instead of constantly fucking with it. The main studies looking at the soil carbon content in the UK grouped together moor and heath. These studies include a variety of soil types with a wide range of carbon content, likely including degraded blanket bog with a high cover of heathers, which falls outside the definition of heathlands. However, the values for carbon stocks in heathland soil from the literature that we do have are similar and range from 82 to 103 tonnes of carbon per hectare, T.C/AHA. And that's your equation. Figures for carbon content of the heathland vegetation component are more variable, from 0.5 to 49. Okay, now that is variable. 0.5 to 49 Tc/8 carbon per tons of carbon per hectare. Let's see. 0.5 to 49 tons of carbon per hectare, probably reflecting the varied conditions of the experimental sites. The higher figure of an uncommon situation, an upland site fenced and unmanaged for 25 years. As a result, it is currently difficult to extrapolate the impact of management on the carbon stores of particular soils. Further studies comparing mineral and organic soils across a range of geographical locations in the uplands and the lowlands would fill a significant evidence gap. It's a case of we can't just treat one area the same way as we would another. However, it does seem like quite for a fair amount of heathland, best way to do it is just don't fuck with the land, and at least try not to disturb the soil so much, and to keep it healthy essentially. Management impacts and carbon sequestration. Tree and scrub management on the heathlands. Evidence indicates that trees growing on heathlands do not necessarily lead to significant gains in carbon stocks. One study indicated that natural afforestation in the uplands only resulted in an additional 3 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year. Further research demonstrated that. So I was getting confused because I wasn't sure if that was a comma or something on my laptop screen. Sorry. Further, research demonstrated that planting trees in upland heath reduced carbon sequestration and increased emissions due to changes in the soil and biodiversity losses. Tree planting in East Anglian heaths also reduced soil carbon by approximately 0.2 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year in the space of 21 years. Trees growing on wetter heathland soils, more likely lowlands, either planted or regenerating naturally, can increase carbon emissions from the soils, but not compensated by the increase in carbon that's stored in the wood. A study has shown that planting trees on 2,000 hectares of coastal heath in Norway could result in 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide sequestered in 50 years, but these heaths have already have 0.9 tons of carbon in the soil now, and per hectare now. And for comparison, the Norwegian national emissions is just from oil extraction are 51.3 to 55 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Therefore, on balance, trees will only sequester a proportionally small amount of carbon, but would damage the biodiversity of an existing habitat with important carbon stores in the soil. So yeah, as I was saying, like with heathland largely, that's where we shouldn't be planting trees. Further research also indicates that the carbon storage of open habitats, grasslands, heathlands and wetlands has traditionally been underestimated, and tree planting may not render the carbon sequestration results expected, as we covered in the woodlands last episode. Reconnecting heathland patches by removing conifer plantations can result in carbon emissions, as does removing scrub and trees from neglected heathlands, but both interventions benefit heathland specialist species. Furthermore, halting the natural growth of trees on most heathlands to maintain or enhance the condition and cater for species characteristic of open heathland involves grazing, removing vegetation regularly, and/or creating bare ground, which involves trade-offs with carbon fluxes. In summary, there may be trade-offs between achieving the conservation objectives for heathlands and their characteristic species, and achieving climate mitigation objectives through afforestation. Soil disturbance as a result of management actions can increase carbon emissions from the soil stock and should be minimised. The widespread natural growth of trees and scrub on heathlands should be controlled to help retain existing heathlands, soil carbon stocks, and cater for heathland species characteristic of open and diverse vegetation structure. Open habitats, including grasslands and heathlands, particularly those in a degraded state, will be lost if tree planting is not carefully planned. This highlights the need to conduct detailed environmental assessments at sites ahead of implementing natural-based solutions in order to minimise the risk of adverse outcomes. And not just when trying to implement natural-based solutions, but when trying to do anything. Actually do a real assessment of the land. Because otherwise you're just creating more problems later down the line, which we have done. This is us learning from it. Restoration from the grassland. Heathlands have changed into poor quality Heathlands that have changed into poor quality grasslands as a result of increases in nutrient availability or inappropriate management should be restored, as they can store more carbon with an ericaceous cover. Restoring upland heathlands can be achieved by adjusting grazing pressure, reducing inappropriate burning, and clearing bracken. Lowland heathland restoration from degraded grassland or former agricultural grasslands can include methods such as topsoil removal to reduce nutrient loads, or chemically amending the soil to reduce the pH level, for example through the addition of sulfur to help establish ericaceous cover. However, there may be unintended consequences after these drastic interventions, such as soil or archaeological damage, or increased availability of toxic elements such as aluminium, or impacts on invertebrates which need site-specific restoration plans. Adding seeds or plant plugs to the soil can sometimes be necessary too. For example, one study found that degraded upland heathlands that changed into grassland had slightly larger vegetation carbon stocks. And that was at 1.8 tons of carbon per hectare per year more, but much smaller carbons, had slightly larger vegetation carbon stocks than it did soil carbon stocks, than the target heathland habitat, which is about 12 tons of carbon per hectare in vegetation and 102 tons of carbon per hectare per year, respectively, in the soil. So overall, the system had lost carbon by being in poor condition. On the other hand, restored heathland had similar vegetation carbon content to the target heathland, only 0.1 tons of carbon per hectare less, and the soil carbon stock was only slightly smaller, at 1.9 tons of carbon per hectare less. Overall, where heathlands are degraded and changed into grasslands, their soil carbon stocks are significantly lower than good quality heathland habitats. Therefore, where possible, management practices should aim to restore heathlands to improve to their target heathland habitat condition to improve carbon stocks. Now, when it comes to burning has been traditionally used to manage heathland vegetation, but heathlands change from carbon sinks to sources when burned due to reduced photosynthesis and increased emissions, especially if the fire takes place in the summer. However, it is possible that controlled fires on upland heathland that do not damage the organic soil layer and do not have an underlying peat layer could be carbon neutral, though this depends on the burn intensity, severity, and rotation length. Longer burning cycles, smaller proportions burnt annually, avoiding peat soils, and burning under appropriate burning conditions based on good practice can help to reduce carbon emissions from burning heaths. Less frequent burning and on smaller areas can also help to improve the habitat condition by producing a more diverse vegetation structure. Careful, controlled burning of heathland can be carried out to achieve biodiversity objectives, but needs to follow good practice, and that comes from the heather, grass, and moor burn codes. And we have a graph that basically displaying that. So, yeah, I would have thought that too much burning would have caused damage to the soil as it is, and landowners can get pretty sloppy with their land management. So yeah, how long's left on this chapter? Not long. Okay. So, number 4, climate change adaptation potential. Both lowland and upland heathlands have been described as having a medium sensitivity to climate change. Heathlands are sensitive to changes in hydrology and the potential increase in the extent and frequency of fires due to projected higher temperatures and more frequent severe droughts. Also, heather beetle outbreaks could potentially increase in numbers due to warmer winters. These factors, coupled with increased nutrient availability, for example through atmospheric nitrogen deposition from fossil fuel burning and intensive farming, could result in unpredicted and unwanted changes in the vegetation composition and structure, for example increased biomass, which could affect the current biodiversity of the habitat. Increased nitrogen deposition does however lead to increased carbon sequestration in the litter and organic horizons until a point of saturation, and managing the heather to maintain it at a young growth stage or building phase maximises carbon sequestration. Both upland and lowland heathlands are likely to suffer a deterioration in condition and change into other habitat types as a result of changes in climate. In the lowlands, this is likely to involve a change from lowland heathland to acidic grassland. Meanwhile, upland heath vegetation is expected to become more similar to that of lowland heath. Drought can result in increased carbon dioxide emissions in wet heaths. Carbon in soils decreased by 60% with experimentally induced drought in just 2 months. Fucking hell. Enabling heaths to adapt to climate change will be necessary to enable them to continue to act as a natural based solution, reducing other pressures such as recreational disturbance and atmospheric nitrogen deposition, and continuing appropriate management may, I'm adding words in for some reason, may help heathland sites adapt to climate change. Tree cover, particularly native broadleaves, for example birch or pedunculate oak, and in Scotland native Caledonian pine, could be allowed to grow in some areas, particularly ecotones, to provide some heterogeneity in the landscape. However, to reduce the loss of heathland species and maintain favourable condition. The tree cover should be kept below 15% in lowland heathlands and below 20% scattered native trees and scrub in upland heathlands. In a changing climate, appropriate management of heathlands can help to conserve the soil, especially organic soil, which accumulates carbon, reduce the impact of flooding and wildfires, increase biodiversity, especially of characteristic heathland species, for example, solitary bees and wasps, and provide connections with nature that can be enjoyed by us all. So yeah, it really is, with heathland, it really is a case of, in a lot of cases, try not to disturb the land by building on it, or, you know, having those parties all the fucking time, like mass parties and shit all the time on heathland. Really not a good idea. And burnings need to be done a lot, need to be done smaller and less intense, and in more ideal areas. So for 5, biodiversity value. Historically, heathlands have been home to a wide range of species. Today in England alone, lowland heathlands are home to 133 priority species, and upland heathlands to 35, most of which require bare ground and short vegetation, which can only be provided by active management. Conversely, less than a third of these species require scrub or wood edge. Therefore, neglect or afforestation would benefit very few heathland species and would be detrimental to the majority. It's been suggested that dynamic scrub, for example, scrub developing in some areas for a few years before being controlled, in particular including birch, willow, gorse and hawthorn, without becoming dominant or developing into large blocks, that should be encouraged. Large-scale habitat mosaics could potentially support more priority species, although some priority species require very specific conditions or management. For example, heavy grazing in soil, or soil disturbances and or ungrazed nectar sources and or scrub. On the other hand, reductions in intensity of management, especially in grazing and mixed grazing with cattle and ponies, can contribute to restoration and reduce fragmentation of upland, heathland and associate large-scale habitat mosaics to the benefit of some scarce and declining upland species. So it really is a case of not trying to do a blanket coverage of the same kind of land management. You can't be lazy about it. Trade-offs. 6, trade-offs. There may be a temptation to try and address the climate emergency by proposing potentially quick fixes, such as planting trees extensively or allowing natural succession towards woodland, including on heathlands. However, as shown above, the open habitats are important for specialised biodiversity and, in the case of heathlands, important carbon stores. As mentioned previously, tree planting without due environmental assessments, as happened last century and still happens today, can not only damage or destroy valuable wildlife habitats on heathlands, but also result in the opposite of the intended outcome: carbon emissions when planting on organic wet soils. Carbon sequestration in woods may take years to compensate for these emissions. No single land use management practice will result in significant carbon sequestration on heathlands, but various management approaches have other considerable benefits. For example, positive impacts on heathland biodiversity or maintaining soil carbon stocks. Research by Thomas et al. 2013 found that strategies focused solely on carbon stores were largely inadequate for protecting biodiversity, but when carbon and biodiversity value were given joint priorities, up to 90% of both could be protected. I mean, it's probably best to take a targeted approach rather than a blanket approach. Again, it comes down to that thing again, doesn't it? Simple answers. There aren't any simple answers to this stuff. But people are like, oh, just plant trees in the right places, and the right trees in the right places. 7. Assessment of the quality of the evidence. There has been some research in the last 2 decades on the impact of management on the carbon fluxes of dwarf shrub heathlands, heath habitat. However, the information available is still limited. Studies show a large range of results, as reflected earlier. As shown earlier, a reflection of the heterogeneity of the habitat as a result of climate, geography, history, management, and conservation status. Although the above information can be used to assess the likely impact of management interventions in terms of carbon emissions or sequestration, it is difficult to apply directly to specific areas. More studies are needed covering the range of the geographical distribution of heathlands, particularly more experimental studies looking at vegetation on different soil types. Yeah, I will always say that we'll always need more research. So, number 8, in conclusion, in summary, natural-based solutions in heathland habitats should primarily aim to retain as much carbon in situ as possible at the same time benefit the heathland's biodiversity. This should include appropriate heathlands management that, 1, control the widespread natural growth of trees and scrub on heathlands to help retain existing heathland soil carbon stocks and cater for heathland species characteristic of open and diverse vegetation structure. Any removal of trees that must be conducted in a way that least disturbs the soils to preserve carbon soil stocks. Number 2, restore heathlands that have changed into poor quality grasslands to target heathland habitat conditions to help sequester more carbon and enhance heathland biodiversity. And 3, strictly follow good practice, for example, heather and grass burning and moor burn codes with regards to the burning of heathland, and avoid burning that could damage organic soil layers beneath the vegetation. Simultaneously, natural-based solutions can facilitate the adaptation of heathlands to future climate scenarios. To capitalise on this, alongside the recommended management practices above, management of heathlands should also include, number 1, blocking artificial drainage present to increase water retention in heathlands and avoid wet heaths drying out and releasing more carbon. This has added public benefit of reducing the risk of flooding downstream. Number 2, increasing the area and especially width of fire breaks to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires under drought conditions. On sandy soils, mineral soils, these bare and sparsely vegetated open areas will also provide valuable habitat for many invertebrates and notable vertebrate species such as sand lizards, which are on the decline. Sand lizards are gorgeous. And 3, promoting the use by wild or semi-wild herbivores in heathland areas to prevent woodland encroachment and biomass accumulation. Overall, heathland habitats are important for specialised biodiversity and act as important carbon stores with the potential to facilitate adaptation to climate change. Therefore, heathlands should be managed in order to maximise these co-benefits and to function effectively as a natural-based solution. And we've got case studies to look at with pictures and stuff that you can see in the graph at the bottom of here, and then loads of reference referring for the evidence shown above. Let me know what you guys thought. This is a slightly shorter section, but then again, as already stated, heathlands is a bit more basic. It's like it's more to do with the burnings and actually looking at open areas. Let me know what you guys think on this one. If you live around heathland, let me know what it's like up there. Do you get what the wildfires like? What are the managed fires like? How do the landowners up where you live manage the land? Do they manage it well? Do they not? What do you think of the blocking artificial drainages? It's on heathland to prevent to increase water retention in heathlands and avoid wet heaths drying out and releasing more carbon. Adding the other added benefit being reducing the risk of flooding downstream. What do we think of this? I think this is good. That to me is one of the best bits on this. What do you think of this as a whole? Like, we need to look after each of these. Do you agree with me, for example, that we really can't just go, oh, we need to plant trees to store carbon? We actually have to look at these different habitats carefully, and we can't just go, oh, plant a load of pine or plant a load of oak or something like that. We have to do it properly. So next time we do this, on the next episode of this, it will be peatland, as I thought, and looks like there's a few more authors in the next one. But yeah, I'm gonna finish it here. I'm not gonna do the climate and the statement on what was it? What does he call it? Ed Miliband's statement of state of climate and nature statement. I will do that probably tomorrow. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. Please like, subscribe. I will put the link to this in the description below. My sword at your service badges and my shield at your backs. Freaks, love and blessings.